It's a challenge to be within a colonial institution, especially like a government, especially when you're not the leader, because policy in governments tends to be a top-down system, right? You're directed. You uphold, under our democracy setup, you uphold the party line and the government's line. If you're a member of the government, if you're a member of the opposition, you have a different role. So not all of those allow Indigenous peoples, even in those positions, to necessarily uh, contribute or force the type of change much of the community may want to see. That's not really how our current democracy actually functions in terms of the political parties and the parliamentary system that we inherited or took from Britain. Doesn't really allow individual politicians to wholesale change the way government works, government policy. It's sort of not how it happens. So even when you have Indigenous people, and believe me, many of them have done remarkable things, you're still ultimately in a colonial system, and you're in a government that really its existence, right? You have to remember the colonial government has never served Indigenous people, ever. Quite the opposite. The whole point of a colonial government is to take from Indigenous people and pass that on to the settler colonial population. So to reconcile, if you're an Indigenous person in those governments, even with representation, it's very challenging since we're such a small part of the population, and we've never formed a government. There's never been, an Indigenous party that's actually formed government. I think it would be an interesting thing to see what that would be to have an Indigenous prime minister and what that might actually look like. But I also think it's a challenge for all Indigenous people necessarily to imagine that a colonial government is actually for them, because it historically has not been. So I commend those that go into politics, that engage on that level. I've spent much of my time in colonial institutions, but I can tell you it's not easy, and I've certainly found in my experience it made my commitment to my community stronger, having spent time in those spaces. Um, so I think it's a worthy thing to look for, more representation on the political side, but that probably isn't going to be sufficient enough to bring about the change that's required.